Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursaleen. Sayyidina wa Habibina Mawlana Muhammadin sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa barik wa sallim. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una wa zidna 'ilma ya muqallibal qulub. Thabbit qulubana ala dinik. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So I thought I would speak today a little bit. Alhamdulillah, we have Women's Day today. And I think one of the most discussed topics is the topic of women and Islam. And there's like a whole range of positions, and there's a whole range of discussions, and there's a whole range of controversies with regard to that topic matter. Meaning what? On the one spectrum, you would have people who would hold the position that Islam is there to preserve women's rights and to grant equity and to grant justice. And this has been embodied in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam until our time. That's on the one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum, people will hold that Islam is responsible for the abuse of women and the subjugation of women and abuse and many other social ills, and they are done because of religion and because of the teachings within the Quran and because of the teachings within Hadith. And these teachings basically contribute towards this legacy of injustice and oppression. So you have that, and then you have a cohesive position in the middle as well. So that's the spectrum depending on who you are speaking to. And so I thought I just wanted to share with you 3 thoughts with regard to that. And it's a difficult discussion, and it's a complex discussion, and there are many subtopics. But I thought I would just share 3 thoughts with you, and perhaps that could be somewhat of. They're just thoughts I just think about in terms of how to frame the discussion. So the first thing is that we live in a we're already becoming, and we're becoming more and more a very liberal secular culture. So there's a very strong liberal secular culture that is becoming stronger and stronger, to such an extent where that voice, that narrative, is becoming the norm. It is becoming the default position, and any other position is seen as problematic. And I think that has been happening very rapidly within the last few years, especially. And I think that's the context that we find ourselves in. So within that context, there are a number of movements or labels or philosophies that are being used. And for example, if you take the term feminism, and now if I ask you the question, are you an Islamic feminist? And for a moment, if I ask that question, are you an Islamic feminist? So many of you might say yes, and many of you might say no, and many of you might say, I don't know what that means. And I think what I'm weary of is that there are labels and philosophies and mindsets being created outside the framework of Islam, and then those labels and philosophies are imposed on Islam, and then a Muslim is then faced with a binary choice. A binary choice in the sense that I either subscribe to that label or I don't subscribe to that label. I'll give you an example. So, example, say you have the feminism label, without breaking down in too much detail what that means. Let's say that means, for example, that in all situations, men and women have exactly the same rights and duties, and there's no distinction whether it's politically, whether it's socially, whether it's with regard to any aspect. There is absolutely no division. So that is the label. And let's say we add gender to that, and we say that that there is no binary gender, and there is gender fluidity, and gender is not linked to biology, it's linked to a social construct. And say this label comes, and now this label is brought into an Islamic discussion. Then a Muslim almost has like a binary choice. Yes, I subscribe to that label because in the name of justice and equity it makes sense to me. Or no, I don't subscribe to that label because some of those things conflict with my teachings. And you find yourself in that uncomfortable space. For example, say we have the human rights label coming now. So obviously we all agree human rights with basic education, housing, those human rights are fine. But what about the right for everybody to speak in the name of God? Is there something valid in our mindset? The right for people to do what they want without any outside moral or ethical code. That you have complete freedom. You can design relationships like you want. You can do what you want as long as in brackets you don't hurt anybody. Is that is that does that when that label comes to Islam, then we almost like a binary choice. Yes, I agree because I agree with individual freedoms and la ikraha fi deen, or no, I don't agree because some of those things completely go against my moral code. We believe in certain teachings, guidelines, social structures, and so on. So we're always faced with this uncomfortable space. Like, for example, I had a discussion with some students in the week and they spoke about Black Lives Matter. So when Black Lives Matter comes to Islam, then I'm faced with the choice, do I subscribe and do I not? So there maybe it's an easy choice because why? Because Islam is very anti-racist, so there I can subscribe to it. But what if it comes to Black Trans Lives Matter? Black Trans Lives Matter. If I add a sifa now, am I still now, did I suddenly change my association or did I change it? So I think this is that's the first reflection I want to make is when the labels come from outside Islam. For example, even a simple thing like capitalism. Is Islam capitalist? Is Islam socialist? Is Islam this? Is Islam that? It's outside labels that are brought within the world of Islam, and then a Muslim is then given a choice. I subscribe to the label or I don't subscribe to the label. I agree with the label or I don't agree. And the first thing I want to question and I want to caution against is that I don't believe it's healthy for a Muslim to position themselves within a label that is created outside that has good in it and has problematic areas in it. You can't wholeheartedly subscribe to something like that. I believe that Islam needs to be discussed within its own space. Like, for example, is Islam patriarchal? Is Islam patriarchal? Now the label of patriarchy comes towards Islam, then I must answer and say, no, Islam is not patriarchal because men and women are spiritually equal. Or yes, Islam is patriarchal because the man is the Amir in the house. And depending on the response, you're either a good guy or a bad guy, depending on who you're speaking to. And I find it problematic that we keep importing the label and then trying to place Islam on a yes, no binary choice. I think it's very problematic. So I think the first thing is that um, postmodernism is about deconstruction, and we have to deconstruct the deconstructivists. So those labels, I would caution us about speaking about Islam in terms of is Islam feminist, is Islam capitalist, is Islam patriarchal, is Islam humanist in its approach, is Islam socialist. I would caution us against speaking about Islam in these broad label terms. I think Islam needs to be spoken about on its own, with its own teachings. However, you then choose create a label based on you think that is patriarchal or equity, or that's your own business, but this is what Islam presents and doesn't necessarily fit into a preconceived label, a preconceived notion. So I think this is the first thing, is that discuss Islam on its own terms. You don't have to give it a label and say it's all about equity, all about patriarchy, all about this. Islam is what it is. It is what it is, and in Arabic that's called hidayah, that's called guidance. It is a set of guidance. And that guidance has a specific belief structure. We believe about the world in a certain way. That guidance has a certain political structure. We think about authority in a certain way. That guidance has a certain social structure. We arrange families and relationships between human beings in a certain way. That guidance has a certain economic structure. We have certain economic guidelines. Whatever you're going to map that or call that, that's a separate discussion, but the guidance is the guidance on its own. And I want Muslims and students not to feel uncomfortable with that. Just because you don't fit into someone else's label. These discussions are often very nuanced. You don't have like broad discussions like men and women in Islam are equal. What is it? What does equal mean? You have to break those things down. There are nuance in these discussions. So that is the first point that I'd like to make, and I think it's a very critical point. And if you are not feeling the heat in your own lives, I can guarantee you, your teenagers and your young children at schools and universities are feeling the heat of this discussion, because they are being forced to make a choice and say, I subscribe to this or I don't subscribe to this. And that's in a sense, it's a false choice. It's a false choice. Because there are elements we agree with many movements of, and there are elements we disagree, and we do so in the name of Islam. So I think the first thing is, and if I can put one label on the first discussion, that the first label is that or the first approach when it comes to women and Islam is that we should be critical of existing paradigms. Because otherwise you find yourself in a very difficult spot, and you find yourself twisting and turning and trying to cover up on the things you feel uncomfortable with. There's no discomfort in Islam. There's really no discomfort within Islam. So that is the first thing. The second thing, the second category is what I would consider to be compassion. Compassion. Because when we speak about injustice, we speak about abuse, we speak about oppression, we are speaking about lived realities. Sometimes when we speak about Islam, we speak about Islam in an abstracted sense. We say men and women are equal before Allah Ta'ala, or men and women honor each other. But we have to be compassionate and acknowledge that there are lived realities. And some of these lived realities are positive and beautiful, and some of these lived realities are terrible. And sometimes, and often, not sometimes, there is a problem with gender-based violence. The problem does exist. And that problem exists also within the Muslim community. And that problem often exists by individuals claiming to do it in the name of Islam. And we have to have compassion, and we have to have honesty and acknowledgement that these things happen. We can't just whitewash and say, no, Islam is perfect, all those things. Muslims are imperfect. People are imperfect. And we have to have compassion. Why? Because often movements are reactionary to certain structures of abuse within society, structures of inequality and injustice and oppression within society. Movements are reactionary to that. And instead of us condemning completely the reactionary movement, saying this feminism thing is not Islamic and we don't believe in it all and it's contrary to the teaching of Islam, understand people's concerns, understand people's lived reality, understand why these movements have been born, and acknowledge them. And sometimes, not sometimes, often these things are done in the name of Islam. And in the name of Islam, that is an abuse of Islam. There's an abuse of the teachings of our Lord and our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the second thought I'd like to share is simply this: when you enter into a discussion about this, have compassion for people you don't agree with their conclusions. A person's journey makes them arrive at a certain conclusion. You might not agree with the conclusion, but have compassion for the journey. And from there we get the word ikhtilaf, because the word ikhtilaf comes from the word khalf, and khalf means to be what comes behind. And therefore, when you come to the conclusion, you disagree, but have compassion to the khalfiyah. The ikhtilaf comes from the khalfiyah, from what comes behind. Have compassion for that. Acknowledge the wrongs in that. And acknowledge that sometimes those wrongs, and oftentimes those wrongs, are done in the name of Islam. And that itself is condemnable. That is something that we oppose. So this is the second thought. So the first thought was to be critical of existing paradigms and not to superimpose them onto Islam, where we're forced to make a binary choice between the two. The second point was to have compassion with those we agree with and those we don't agree with, because the lived reality is far from the ideal teachings. And the third point and the final point I want to make is that oftentimes when we frame the discussion around women, we frame it around specific teachings regarding women. We frame it around inheritance. We frame it around the verse of Darb in the Quran. We frame it around the right to divorce. We frame it around polygamy, slavery. We frame it around 2 witnesses versus 1 witness. We frame it around a certain set, a limited set of what is perceived to be controversial discussions, because they don't accord to a liberal ideology or a liberal progressive ideology, and we frame the discussion of women in Islam around those 4 or 5 points. I do feel that we need to frame the discussion more holistically, and when I mean that is that the Quran comes as guidance from Allah Ta'ala, and there is one man who embodies that guidance, and he is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And aside from the laws that come, like the cold, harsh directive, the cut and dried laws, there is the lived example, there is the actual example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the discussion, the defining discussion around anything is actually Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he is the mubayyin of the Quran. He is the one that explains the Quran through his words and through his actions. So one cannot have a discussion about anything in Islam without including Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And therefore, for us to understand what his relationship was with women, with his wives, with his children, with those who served him, with those in his community, what was his relationship? What was his attitude? What was the virtues and the ethics of that time? And I think this needs to be the central framing point in our discussion with regard to any subject in Islam, including women and Islam. Because he sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the benchmark. He is the role model. And any interpretation that goes against his example is an invalid interpretation. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I'm not going to quote, and many people will in these days of women's rights, will quote those examples of who Rasulullah was with his family. I mean, there are many quotations that come to mind. The Prophet ﷺ says, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَ. The best of you are those who learn the Quran and teach the Quran. That's a famous one. The Prophet ﷺ also says, خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِهِ. The best of you are those who are the best to your wives. in Arabic can mean wife or family. The best to your wives and the best to your family. وَأَنَا خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِي, and I am the best to my family. The Prophet ﷺ is saying that khair of the Quran, of the one that learns and teaches the Quran, is the same khair as that person who teaches his wife well. It's the same khair. It's the same goodness. It's both khairukum. That's the Prophet ﷺ's words. And then in his actions and his life, the Prophet ﷺ is compassionate to a degree that you and I cannot be. If you study his Shama'il, if you study his Sirah, the Prophet ﷺ is compassionate. The Prophet ﷺ has sabr. The Prophet ﷺ has haya. The Prophet ﷺ has such beauty that you and I can never emulate. And this becomes the defining standard of a gender role in Islam. Is this beautiful example of Rasulullah ﷺ to his wives, to his children. The Prophet ﷺ's wives spoke their mind, and even though he was Messenger of Allah ﷺ, they on multiple occasions, you'll have Salama speaking her mind. You have Aisha radiallahu anha speaking their mind on things that we would even think like, I think is, Salama famously mentioned about because in Arabic the Jammu Dhakar Salim includes the male and the female. Salama says, why didn't Allah Ta'ala mention the female explicitly? She tells the Prophet ﷺ, why didn't Allah mention the female explicitly? From then Allah reveals verses mentioning the male and the female explicitly, even though they're already included in the Jammu Dhakar Salim. Aisha radiallahu anha, she speaks her mind. Radiallahu anha. And I think that this needs to be the defining discussion about our roles and our interaction. And we should have the discussion on our own terms. Don't feel forced to frame something and to twist something in someone else's paradigm. If this is the guidance of Allah Ta'ala, this is what we subscribe to. Therefore we call Muslims. People are free not to subscribe to it. They have that choice. But if we as Muslims subscribe to, this is what we subscribe to, so let's study the guidance as it is. Let's study the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the teachings of the Quran, the life of the Sahabiyat as it actually is. And that becomes our guidance. And if some of that doesn't concur with someone else's view, that's okay also. That's okay. If our laws of inheritance don't concur to someone else's self-made ideas of equity, that's okay. Because they have their view and we have our view, and that's how our life works. But don't ever feel the pressure to start twisting your faith. Don't feel the pressure to be uncomfortable now just because your teaching doesn't subscribe to someone else's view. And I think this is happening increasingly. People are becoming uncomfortable to say, in Islam actually it's different, and there's no discomfort with this. What is happening is that, and I'll end with this. I'm not going to get into the virtues of women and equity. I think that will be discussed a lot in these days. What is happening is that there is a certain liberal, secular ideology that is becoming universalized. Now it is becoming the universal standard. And the strange thing about that, it becomes the most intolerant ideology. Because it is monolithic. It wants to take over everybody's idea and it wants to become the defining standard. I'll give you one example. For example, today, if you simply state that within Islam, we have a sexual code, that a sexual intimacy exists between a man and a woman within the institution of marriage. And that is our belief. And anything outside that, any other configuration outside that, is not concordant with our sexual code. We don't agree, we don't consider it to be moral. If you say that today, almost like you become an outcast, an outlier. How can you say that? How can you say that? Because now what happened is because a certain liberal, secular ideology is becoming the norm And you can't disagree with it, because if you disagree with it, you're automatically a bad person. For example, if we say in Islam, we have binary gender based on your biology. This is the Islamic teachings, that we have social roles based on your biology. Whether you're a masculine or female, male or female biologically, we also consider that to be your gender roles as well. We don't think there are neutral genders or multiple genders. This is Dhakar wa Untha is the way Allah made people. If you say that today, it becomes problematic. Why? Because you are speaking out against a movement which has become universalized. What we as Muslims have to do is we have to challenge the universalization of that ideology and say that that is not a universal standard that we all have to concur to. That is a standard of a group of people that didn't exist for a very long time, and we have a different standard in place. Our standard is divine guidance, and this is our ideology, and be unapologetic for it. And this is the difficulty of our time. This is the challenge of our time. And by no means would I say that we have all the answers. And sometimes we feel that we have all the answers, like neatly packaged and ready to go. Whatever question you ask, the answer is there. I think there are difficulties. Life is challenging. Understanding things are challenging. A changing world is challenging. There are many things that are really challenging for us as human beings, and sometimes as believers also. This is the challenge of mankind. So and also the lived reality sometimes is so difficult that if I can end with this, religion comes to help people, but religion does not force people to be good. And bad people will do bad things, not because of religion, despite it, even though they may utilize their faith as a tool. And that's the reality, is that there are people who do terrible things, not because of their faith, even though they use their faith. Apartheid was based on Christianity. The problem isn't Christianity, the problem is it's just individuals who have racist ideas, who are looking to harness something, and they harness Christianity. And the same with Islam, people will harness it and use it for twisted ideologies. And this is the reality we find ourselves in. I pray Allah Ta'ala makes us good human beings. I make dua Allah Ta'ala is pleased with us. I make dua Allah Ta'ala guides us in times of great uncertainty and difficulty. I make dua Allah Ta'ala removes all the oppression and all the abuse that happens within those quiet, private spaces of homes. May Allah remove all of that. May Allah bring ease, and may Allah bring also justice as well. And it's not easy. And we have compassion and we have love, and it breaks our heart. The life of a believer is more treasured than the Kaaba. It breaks our heart if one person experiences injustice and abuse. It is too many. And that breaks our heart. As a believer, that is the antithesis of my belief. That is what displeases my Lord, is to harm another human being. Islam is the religion where you don't even harm another being with your thoughts. Can you imagine that? We are the faith that you don't even harm another human being with your thoughts. We have something called husnul dhan. What about your tongue and your hands still? This is actually our faith. This is our faith. Don't let other groupings, ideologies, interpretations, misinterpretations also, sometimes within certain groups of ulama within our faith also, complete misinterpretations that are harmful. Don't let others hijack the discourse. The khair of Islam is with the majority. The khair of Islam is with the thousands of scholars who have been serving this deen. May Allah guide and protect us all. May Allah bless all of our mothers, all of our sisters, all of our daughters on this Women's Day. Make dua. We all have mothers. Many of us have daughters, many of us have sisters. Make dua for them. Therefore, in Islam, you call your Muslim, your like your female in Islam, you call it your sister. A male in Islam, you call it your brother, because it's a family, it's an ummah, and our love is there for the ummah. So may Allah protect all of you, may Allah guide all of you. May Allah grant us to have good men. Men who have masculinity like Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So much talk about toxic masculinity, we should have, and there is toxic masculinity, we should have prophetic masculinity. We should have prophetic masculinity. Allah must mold our masculinity in the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the most beautiful of beings. May Allah guide and protect you all, and please keep us in du'as. Wassalamu alaikum, and may Allah forgive me all my shortcomings, these are just my thoughts, and I may be wrong, and I think it's important to discuss these matters. May Allah guide and protect, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I will stay on with the